Today's lecture continues our discussion of global climate change as a threat to national security. So we left off last time talking about different security threats. One of the biggest ones, the potential for failed states, failed countries, which really means countries that cannot meet the basic needs of people in terms of food, water, and shelter and security. So the potential for failed states across the developing world, poorer countries, happens because they lack the infrastructure to cope with these stressors of climate change. This leaves them open to invasion, to extremism, and terrorist groups move into these areas and establish cells. We've seen this with Al-Qaeda developing cells in Somalia, Sudan, Bahrain, Yemen, and even the ISIL group across Syria and parts of Iraq, and with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Another security threat that happens, especially when we see a lack of adequate resources and an increase in terrorist activity, is mass migrations. These can happen within countries, across international borders, and across vast regions. For example, when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, there was a migration of people to Houston, Texas, because that's the next biggest city. Some of those were temporary, but some of them have remained in Houston as permanent citizens. Across international borders, years ago there was a severe cyclone that hit the country of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a very low-lying country that is therefore vulnerable to extreme storm surges. In this case, there was a migration of people from Bangladesh to India. When we have mass migrations, especially across vast regions and international borders, things like racial and religious tensions can exacerbate the problem. We've seen this with people from the Middle East and northern African countries migrating to Europe, the United States, and Canada as a result of extreme drought and tension in those countries. Okay. So, conflicts over resources is going to become increasingly more common because of global climate change. And of course, as we stated, scarcity of potable water supplies, of adequate food and shelter and security is a contributing factor to conflict and instability in already weak or weakly supported governments. We've seen this across northern Africa, so countries like Libya and Egypt, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and even into Syria and Iraq because of destabilization caused when the United States invaded in 2002. So these regional fightings can escalate to be national or international. For example, right now there is civil war happening in the country of Yemen, but that civil war is developed into a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Okay. What this has created in Yemen is widespread famine, widespread illness, and people fleeing areas of conflict to areas of higher security. A really big impact of global climate change on national security comes from direct impact on military systems. Specifically, weapon systems and platforms, so the physical equipment of warfare, military bases that are threatened by sea level rise, military operations, and military personnel, and of course an increase in engagement opportunities. So weapon systems, guns, tanks, aircraft, all of these types of things do not do well in extreme environmental conditions. If you live in Green Bay or Wisconsin and you've ever gone outside on a day when the ambient temperature was -10 and the wind chill was significantly below that, you may have experienced your car battery being very dead. This is because mechanical systems don't do well in extreme temperatures. So you can imagine that fighting in desert conditions, like across the Middle East, where temperatures are very, very high and dust storms are common, the life expectancy of military equipment is greatly reduced, and costly repairs and replacement have to occur. We can also anticipate with climate change potentially rougher seas, which means hampered flight operations and even increased transit times for things that are being carried by ship. In extreme conditions of, say, a tropical storm or a hurricane, then military ships and military flights can be completely shut down. We're seeing increased hurricanes, and what happens when we see them, especially along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, is that military aircraft are moved inland because we don't want multi-billion-dollar equipment destroyed by a hurricane, and Navy ships will often be sent out of port, so out of the line of danger for the same reason. So all of these direct impacts hinder our ability to react quickly should a threat or attack be posed to our country. We can also say that higher temperatures hinder military personnel. Imagine simply being outside on a day when the ambient temperature is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now imagine doing that wearing full military gear with 40 pounds of equipment on your back. And that is what U.S. military people have been experiencing in military operations across the Middle East. It's obvious that you cannot operate at your optimum physical performance when it's 110 degrees outside. Okay. So the United States has many military bases globally. Many of these are coastal, which means they're either going to be forced to relocate as a result of rising ocean levels and higher storm surges, okay, or they're going to have to spend a lot of money on infrastructure in order to protect themselves. What this means is compromised effectiveness and readiness, so longer strike capabilities to move equipment from inland to a coastline where then ships can transport people and materials as needed. We've already seen some of these things occurring. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew destroyed the Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, and in 2004, Hurricane Ivan damaged the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. This latter one is a little bit personal for me because I was born on the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Okay. Climate change is going to mean that military operations will be compromised. As we said, when you have severe weather like a hurricane or strong storm surges, ships and aircraft are grounded. Personnel may be evacuated to get them out of the line of danger. And all of these things compromises our military preparedness in the event of an attack, and it's a distraction from the mission of the military to protect the United States and U.S. interest. Okay? Global climate change is also causing many more disasters globally, which means more possibilities for the military to have to deliver humanitarian aid either within the United States or globally, and to participate in more stability operations as tensions rise across nations globally because of the impacts of climate change. Okay. A really big problem in terms of national security is the warming Arctic. So the ice-free Arctic means that Navy operations have a bigger scope. The Arctic has now become a shipping route for several months out of the year, where it never was before because of the extreme weather there. What this now means is the United States Navy and Coast Guard now has to patrol off the northern coastline of Alaska. This was never a problem. Cold weather also affects weapons just as very warm weather does. Again, we live in the north, we understand that machinery does not always operate well in extreme cold. Now, with the warming Arctic, we're seeing greater access to oil, natural gas, and some other resources that are in the Arctic region. And there has been competition between the United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway for these resources. In particular, Russia has been very aggressive about staking its claim to Arctic oil. There are concerns that this could lead to a second Cold War between the United States and Russia over who has access to these resources and who gets to claim what areas for potential drilling and exploitation of these resources. And a rather funny story, Russia has actually sent a dirigible to plant a Russian flag under the Arctic ice sheet at the North Pole, thinking that by doing so they have claimed the Arctic for Russia. Probably not the case, any more so than the United States being the first country to plant a flag on the moon means that the moon belongs solely to the United States. Okay. Okay. The Department of Defense is dependent on the same national energy grid as the rest of us for their electricity, which means if a hurricane hits Pensacola, Florida, the Naval Air Station there can have a loss of power just as the people in Pensacola, Florida have one if the grid is compromised. Navy ships, airplanes, military gear, tanks, all run on petroleum, which means that the Department of Defense, the military, is very vulnerable to loss of energy supplies. Okay? In different conflicts, such as more recent ones in Iraq, some of the deployed forces have been dedicated simply to moving fuel and protecting fuel supply lines, because if you don't have adequate fuel or adequate energy in the modern era, you cannot conduct warfare or expect to be successful. Now, very interestingly, the Department of Defense has been working with the Department of Energy to pursue energy efficiency, but also alternative fuels to get the U.S. military off of the fossil fuel habit. The U.S. Navy has been conducting a lot of research on use of biofuels, and many of the U.S. Navy's big aircraft tankers now operate solely on biofuels. Okay. All right. So climate change is also going to cause an increase in engagement opportunities overseas for our military. Some of these will be in delivering humanitarian relief within the United States and abroad. So, for example, when the severe earthquake hit Haiti about a decade ago, the U.S. military was the best entity on the planet to quickly deliver humanitarian relief to those areas. As we see more climate-related disasters, we're going to see more opportunities for our military to provide humanitarian aid. The U.S. can also participate in alone or in consortiums or with the United Nations to try and maintain order and help prevent terrorism, as we've seen with the United States helping to fight the ISIL terrorist group in Syria and Iraq. Now, all of these activities affect our military preparedness everywhere. So one could make the argument that maybe the purpose of the military is not to provide humanitarian aid, especially to other countries. However, the developing world and the undeveloped world that are suffering the worst consequences of climate change know very well that they're not the countries that are causing climate change. They know very well that the United States is one of the biggest global CO2 emitters. So they know that we are creating their problem. So not responding and providing aid also has severe consequences. If we want to see global hatred towards the United States grow exponentially, the way to do that, or one way to do that, is to quit providing humanitarian aid. Okay. So in response to this, okay, the U.S. military and the Center for Naval Research have come to a couple of conclusions. One, climate change poses a threat to U.S. national security at home and abroad. You can almost fill in the blank for many other countries. It's a problem with European, Canadian national security. Global climate change also acts as a threat multiplier for instability in already volatile regions of the world like Syria, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Libya, Egypt, and other undeveloped countries and areas that are most highly impacted. It's going to add to tensions in stable regions of the world. So, for example, conflict between India and Pakistan over the flow of rivers that cross international borders. And that national security, energy dependence, and climate change are all related global challenges. So the Center for Naval Research makes a couple of recommendations to help mitigate these issues. One, the consequences of climate change must be integrated into national security and defense strategies. The U.S. should commit to a role to help stabilize climate change to minimize its impacts, and we should commit to global partnerships to help less developed nations manage these impacts. Next, the Department of Defense should adopt improved business practices and innovative technologies to improve combat power through energy efficiency, and especially adding to that, moving away from operating our military through fossil fuels to other more renewable sources in any way we can. And then finally, the Department of Defense should assess the effect on military bases of rising sea levels and extreme weather events. And that's the end of this section. That should hopefully set you up well to work on the third assignment, which is to find a couple of global examples of climate change related disasters and discuss in terms of this CNA report how these posed a threat to national security. In our next unit, we're going to move on and talk about renewable energies and sustainability, so how we can move away from fossil fuels and by doing so eliminate all of the problems that we just got through talking about.